the introduction and the invitation. I really do owe a debt of gratitude to the Lakefield Historical Society, particularly to Derry and the work that he's done and the society has done in preserving the documentary history of Lakefield. I've been fortunate to have two students, students over 2 years, work on special projects through the Trent Center for Community-Based Education on Lakefield. And the material that Derry provided was outstanding and was a significant contribution to the students' work on Lakefield. So I do want to thank you for the good work in the field of preserving the area's history. Tonight I'd like to, well, first of all, bring greetings from the Peterborough Historical Society. It struck me at one of our meetings the other night, our board meetings, and I better finish up with the PHS before I think about the LHS. They do keep one busy, as you know. But it struck me that there are a number of historical societies in the county. And that's, I think, a good reflection of the interest and the dedication of the communities in identifying and preserving and promoting its history. There's Lakefield, there's Peterborough, there's Bridgenorth, there's Harvard, Harvey, Norwood, all these societies, and we all work independently. We don't share necessarily our newsletters, we don't inform each other of special events, monthly lectures. And I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if we formed a kind of a little regional council or some kind of a network that we can share the information amongst the various societies, so that treasures like the material that Kathy brought tonight that might be of interest to other groups would be made available. So something to think about in the future. But tonight I have three tasks. First of all, I want to give a bit of an overview of the history of the waterway, 1834 to 1920. So some 87 years to actually build the Trent-Severn waterway. It's a long history. Some people have compared it to a symphony in several movements. Others have referred to it as a play in several acts. Now, whether that play would be a comedy, a drama, a tragedy, a mystery, it goes on. And as the story evolves, you'll understand why the building of the Trent-Severn waterway has been the longest, both I think in terms of time and distance, public work ever undertaken in this country. By far exceeds the CPR, which was built in just 10 years. Rideau Canal, which was built in 6 years. So there's some, as that famous redhead on TV would say, there's some splaining to do. I think you know who I mean. So I'd like to give an overview of the story of the Trent, how it evolved, and the key influences that resulted in its construction. I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened after the waterway was finished in the 1920s, what was done to promote it, to encourage its development, and what role has government played in more recent years in the development and promotion of the waterway. And finally, because I'm now a retired public servant, I would like to speculate on what the future of the waterway is and some of the challenges and some of the concerns that I have, and be very interested in hearing what you have. Now, it's fairly, I won't say lengthy, but it's about a 30-minute, 35-minute presentation. So I hope you're all comfortably settled. And without further ado, let's get underway. Make sure we're set. Everyone can see?
Yep.
Everyone can hear?
No. Could you turn the mic to you? Yeah.
How's that? Better?
Bring it up a bit.
And up a bit?
Yeah.
Okay, now how's that? Good? I was told when I did a little bit of theater when I was younger, always project to the back. The lady at the back who's the hardest of hearing and always sits at the back to make sure she can hear. She paid the price of her ticket just like the folks in the orchestra seats. So, story of the Trent-Severn waterway, a respectable ditch as it has been referred to. So, get my little mouse out here. And there we go. Well, the waterway story really begins in the War of 1812. And that was because during the conflict with the United States, one of the key factors in the defense of Upper Canada, in fact, the reason why Canada survived through the war, was the control the British maintained over that strategic waterway along the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, right out to the far posts on Lake Superior and Lake Huron. So, as much by good luck as good management, the Canadians avoided the Americans capturing the strategic waterway and cutting off all vital supplies to the upper province. If they had done that at any stage, but particularly at the early stage of the war, the chances are Upper Canada would have just wilted on the vine and the Americans may well have won the war. But they didn't. But it did underscore how important that strategic waterway was for the defense of Upper and Lower Canada and how vulnerable it was. And so that got both of these gentlemen, John Simcoe, who was the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, but also was a commander of a dragoon fencible unit during the American Revolution, so had a good eye on military matters, and the Duke of Wellington, who was the senior military advisor and at one point the Prime Minister in Great Britain. Both of these gentlemen had a real concern for protecting that strategic waterway. And in the 1820s and 30s and in the post-Napoleonic era, the way you do that was with canals. Canals were the principal means of communication, certainly better than roads. And so it was through the Duke's influence and some recommendations from Simcoe at an earlier period, the proposal to bypass the St. Lawrence with a canal system. Part of the construction was undertaken 1826 with the beginning of the Rideau Canal, finished in 1832. That linked Kingston to Ottawa, so you could go up the Ottawa River, down the Rideau system to Kingston, defended by a pretty significant fortification. That left the area from Kingston through Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and to the upper post still vulnerable. And so early on there was some discussion about building a canal that would link Lake Ontario to Georgian Bay and bypass those exposed frontiers. So you've got the military consideration. Also in the 1820s and early 1830s, I think we could fairly call this the golden age of canals. It's a period when the Welland Canal is being built, the Rideau Canal is being built. There's some discussion about building canals along the St. Lawrence River. Various schemes are being proposed to open up the interior of Upper Canada to transportation and through transportation to settlement. You need to be able to provide a means for the settlers to get into the interior. And so in the early 1830s, the governor of Upper Canada hired this gentleman, Nichol Hugh Baird, to undertake a survey of improved navigation between Lake Ontario and Lake Simcoe. Baird was a Scotsman, as many of the successful early engineers were in Upper Canada. Born in Glasgow, did some work on the Caledonia Canal under the great British engineer Thomas Telford. In fact, Telford wrote him a letter of recommendation that Baird took to Upper Canada when he came and used it to get a job working on the Rideau Canal. So he was an obvious choice to do the initial survey and proposed specifications for canal improvements in Upper Canada. So Baird undertook a survey of Lake Ontario, Trenton, right out to Lake Simcoe in the mid-1830s, and came up with a series of recommendations on how the navigation could be improved to allow better access to the interior. The Baird survey, by the way, is probably the earliest, most comprehensive survey undertaken through the Kawartha Lakes region. The original is held by the Trent, Severn Waterway Archives. I've had an opportunity to work with it many times. It is a magnificent work of art, as you can see just by this one sketch alone. It's a fairly large portfolio and does include a wonderful survey by Baird of the area from north of Peterborough right out to Kachewanuka. So there's some real treasures in the TSW archives. So Baird made the proposal, and in fact, the government accepted many of his recommendations, which was to build a series of locks strategically placed along the waterway that would help open the interior. Not by any means a comprehensive system, but it would allow some early steamboats to get in and certainly improve navigation to the interior. And so we see locks being built at Cajun, at Purdy's Mill, today called Lindsay, Crooks Rapids, Hastings, and a couple down along the lower Trent. So a big flurry of activity in the mid-1830s, wonderful golden age that was about to hit the Kawarthas. And you read letters by the Moody's and Thomas Langton. These were men who had large chunks of land. They thought they were going to cash in big time because as the communication improved, the area opened for settlement, and those hundreds and hundreds of acres of land that they owned that were worth not very much without settlers, suddenly when the area becomes open for settlement and there's a rush of people, the values of land is obviously going to go up. So they were, everyone was speculating and looking forward to boom times in Upper Canada. Well, the late 1830s weren't quite as prosperous. Severe depression hits, crop failures, and it leads to not only economic difficulties, but political difficulties. And another Scotsman, I won't say took advantage, but felt the pressures that those difficulties brought to the colony. And when political reform failed, Mackenzie and a group of his supporters led a ill-fated attempt at overthrowing the government in Upper Canada. We know it as the Upper Canada Rebellion. It was put down in December of 1837 without a great deal of fuss. The real threat to Upper Canada wasn't so much internal from Mackenzie and his followers, the rebels. The real threat came the following year in 1838 when Mackenzie skipped across to the United States and all along the border preached the gospel of Canadians suffering under the yoke of British tyranny and just waiting to be liberated by the Americans. Sound familiar? Well, there were lots of guys hanging around the taverns where Mackenzie was speaking, and they thought, what a great idea. We'll march into Canada, free all those poor oppressed Canadians, and they'll want to join the United States. And so they organized impromptu militia. They acquired weapons. There's a certain irony in the story that this is a terrorist group in American soil plotting the overthrow of the legitimate government of Upper Canada. And in fact, in 1838, they made several raids into Canada. They raided across the St. Lawrence at Prescott, across the Niagara River, and across the Detroit River. There were battles, there were casualties, there was property destroyed, lives lost. It was a real threat, and the government of the day had to respond. And so they called out the militia, they reinforced some of the old border posts from the War of 1812 that had been allowed to deteriorate. In other words, there was a major shift in priorities from internal canal development to defense of the border. The result was, unfortunately, all of the projects that had been started under Baird superintendents, canal projects and locks that were being built, all the money was diverted, contractors didn't get paid, the workers couldn't get paid, they left, and what we ended up with was a real mess. Locks half built, stone and wood lying around, no contractor, no laborers. The whole canal project ground to a halt. Of course, Lord Durham came over after the rebellions to look at finding a solution for the British government to resolve this political crisis in Canada. Recommended that Upper and Lower Canada be joined as a single province, which happened. And they set up a more efficient, organized bureaucracy to manage the internal affairs of the country, partly as a way of dealing with some of the issues that Mackenzie highlighted. One of the departments they set up was the Department of Public Works, and put this gentleman, H.H. Kaleli, in charge of all of the public works, whether it be dams or lighthouses, canals. He was in charge. One of the first things that Kaleli did after he assumed office was to go on a tour with Mr. Baird and look at the state of the lock projects from Lake Ontario right out up to Botcajun, where the work was on. And I kept thinking, poor Baird, what a sad tale to have to show your new boss. Canals half finished, earthworks slumped in, material disappeared, wood rotting, a huge expense and very little to show for that. So Kaleli, I'm sure, was not impressed with what he saw. And by the 1840s, we're starting to see a new means of transportation beginning, not so much in Canada, but it's certainly starting, and that's the advent of the railway. And so there was some thought that maybe canals were an investment that really wouldn't bring the kind of returns that the country needed. Instead, what Kaleli recommended was the locks that we had started, we should finish. I mean, the work's been half done, you might as well finish that off. No new canal projects, no new locks. Instead, because the economy had shifted from settlement to a growing lumber industry by the 1840s, the colony's economy had turned around. Lumber was becoming a big resource that could be exported to Britain. And so Kaleli recommended that the most advantageous solution to this waterway story was to build a series of timber slides, log dams, to allow the logs being cut up in the Kawartha area to be flushed down the system, shipped out through Quebec across to the Royal Navy of Britain. And so what we had was, by the early 1840s, work on those few logs completed and a series of timber slides built along the waterway from Trenton right through to up to Buckhorn. So you see them at places like Hastings, Healy Falls, Buckhorn, Myers Island. And through the 1840s and 50s, lumbering was a major undertaking. It certainly was an important industry here in Lakefield by the 1850s. The sawmills are starting to develop. Families like the Stricklands are getting involved in the lumbering industry and making a very tidy profit out of the business. And so interest in the canals kind of declined, and instead the focus was on certainly managing the waterways, but designing them so they would accommodate the logging industry. So that's the 1840s and 1850s. By 1867, we have another significant milestone in the history of our country, and that's the debates over Confederation and the creation of the Dominion of Canada with the passing of the Canada Act in Great Britain. And so one of the key debates prior to the creation of Canada was the division of powers. What powers would this new government in Ottawa have, and what powers would the provinces have? And who would own the various assets? Well, it was decided in 1867 by the Fathers of Confederation that national works would become the responsibility of the federal government. Local works would be those responsibility of the province. And so the federal government assumed responsibility for the canals. But in the early years, in the 1860s and early 1870s, the federal government, particularly under Johnny Macdonald, had a whole different set of priorities. Macdonald was keen on expanding the 4 little colonies that made up the new Dominion. He had made commitments to British Columbia to bring them into Confederation with the creation of a transcontinental railway. So you can see through the early 1870s that the federal government is really committed to railway expansion across the prairies. Not much interest in this little canal linking these small little communities along the Kawarthas. So instead, the province of Ontario, even though they didn't have necessarily jurisdictional, legislative, or constitutional authority, were getting a lot of pressure from communities to open up further areas for settlement, to make transportation easier, and to build additional locks and canals. And so they hired, the senior engineer for the Ontario government's Department of Public Works, Stephen Tully, was put in charge of the project. Tully's an interesting gentleman. Another Irishman, was also a very accomplished architect. If you've been to Coburg and been into Victoria Hall, which I'm sure many of you have, that was a design of Kiva Tully. So pretty impressive architectural legacy that he's left. He was also put in charge of building 3 locks along the system to help open up the area a little further for development. And so Tully was responsible for locks at Young's Point. Mind you, this is built by the provincial government, and without any intent of expanding the system. You know, we're not looking at a comprehensive vision of building a waterway to link Lake Ontario to Georgian Bay. We're looking at a series of locks built over a number of years to open up areas for settlement, to improve transportation, whether it's for produce or minerals or other kinds of resources. And so, again, another little chunk of the waterway story in the 1870s with locks at Young's Point, which you see there, built by the province, Rosedale, and finally, Lock at Lindsay. So that was kind of the province's contribution to this system of internal navigation. Well, there were many people along the waterway who saw the work of the province, and they really felt that A, was a federal responsibility, and there was a need for expanding the system to open up yet more areas to improve the internal communication. The government was reluctant to undertake any further expenses. The best way to convince governments, you form a lobby group and you hammer away at the politicians. And this gentleman was probably one of the most effective lobbyists for the area. Moss and Boyd formed an association that included the Reeves and mayors, leading figures of finance, including the Stricklands here from Lakefield, into the Trent Valley Canal Association. It was a very effective lobby group that went through the communities, collecting petitions, collecting signatures, meeting with area politicians, and going up to Ottawa to lobby the government to continue expanding the system from the few little locks that were built in the 1830s, the couple of locks that the province built. They wanted to see the system expanded right up to Georgian Bay. The federal government, as they often did when pressured, hired some surveys to look at the work, get a cost for us. How much would it cost to do the work? And surprisingly, come election time was when the government seemed to think that expanding the system would be a really good idea. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. But every time there would be an election coming up, the government would issue a small contract, either for some survey work or dredging. So the story of the Trent-Severn waterway and politics has a long history for sure. And so with the survey work by the Stark engineer and the very effective lobbying of the Trent Valley Canal Association under people like Moss and Boyd, who had no hesitation writing the Prime Minister and saying, we've got to get this canal built. If you want to elect Conservatives along the waterway, here's what you need to do. And the Prime Minister listened. So in the early 1880s, just before the election, they announced that yes, indeed, they were going to expand the system with 3 additional locks. One at Fenland Falls, a flight lock, so 2 locks were built. One at Buckhorn, and one at Burley Falls. So McDonald's hope was that would take a little bit of the pressure off. Certainly the sort of evolution of the waterway system through the 1880s to serve local interests, no broad national vision, and no real commitment by the government to build a system from Lake Ontario right out to Georgian Bay. It's kind of like Topsy, it just evolved through political pressure, economic necessity, the will of the government, and resources to actually expand the system piecemeal over time. And so we have a few more locks added into the system through the 1880s. Well, that helped a little bit, but if MacDonald thought that would buy off the canal promoters, he was wrong, because no sooner had the announcement for these new locks being built, they're back to Ottawa pressing for yet more construction. And what they had envisioned by the 1870s and early 1880s was not so much a system geared to promote the lumber trade, although saw lumber was still an important commodity. But what they were looking at by the 1880s is the expansion of the Canadian West, and in particular, the development of red fife wheat and the potential of thousands and thousands of bushels of prairie wheat being shipped through the system, through the Great Lakes, out to Quebec and to markets overseas. The canal promoters said, we've got the perfect solution to this demand for an improved economic transportation network. Why not complete the Trent Severn waterway? It's more efficient than going through the Great Lakes, through the Welland to bypass Niagara Falls, worry about freeze up, when you can build a series of barges. Now this is what they envisioned, prairie wheat loaded onto barges going through a completed Trent Severn waterway. This is in the 1880s. And they convinced the government that there was some merit to this. So the government, now you can see these are actually examples from Britain. I have this out of one of my British canal books. But it gives you an idea of what the promoters were actually suggesting could be done. It seemed a bit fanciful. The government said, well, we need to do a proper survey. And so they hired this gentleman, Thomas Stafford Rubidge, who was a nephew of Charles Rubidge. Very accomplished engineer. Came over, in fact, under his uncle's tutelage. Was primarily responsible for work along the St. Lawrence system. So he was dragooned to come up to Peterborough to supervise the construction of the locks at Buckhorn and Burleigh and Fenland, and undertake a survey to look at the cost of expanding the system to meet the demands of the Trent Valley Canal Association. Now, Rubidge was dead set against building this wasteful canal through the Corpus. He was committed, he felt that the most efficient way to move produce from the west was along the Great Lakes St. Lawrence route. He had dedicated his entire working career to the St. Lawrence system. That's where he worked. And he really resented being pulled in to do this survey work for the Trent. And Mr. Rubidge was one of his great engineer, but very politically naive. He made it known quite loudly, quite clearly to whoever would listen. He thought this whole thing was a waste of time and money, and no way should the government be using his talents wasteful up here on this scheme for a Trent Severn waterway when he really should be developing the St. Lawrence system. Well, you can imagine how well that went over in Peterborough, which is where he was based, when all the local politicians, the reeves, the mayors, the chamber people, businessmen are pushing to get this canal built. And here is a government-appointed engineer saying what a waste of time and money it is. So they had some suspicions. In fact, for some of the staff who were working on the waterway here in Peterborough and area, that was their livelihood. They had visions of a great career building the system. And here their boss comes in and says, I'm going to do everything, didn't say it directly, I will do what I can to make sure the time and effort and money is spent where it's best needed. And that's not here in Peterborough, it's down along the St. Lawrence River. In fact, the tensions between Rubidge and his staff got so bad, there are accounts of him getting involved in a fist fight with one of his staff members. At one point he was asked how his survey and report was coming, and he wrote back, got beat severely about the head by one of his underlings, unable to finish report. And I have to tell you, the image of these two senior government engineers in an office here in Peterborough, scrapping it out down on the floor, fisticuffs going, shows you how wild canal politics and canal history has been. Anyways, Rubidge did come up with a report and an estimate for what it would cost to expand the system. And he pegged the price at $10 million. Well, you can imagine when that came out in the local press, everyone felt that this was a put-up job. He had been brought in here not to do a survey, but to inflate the cost and write fini to any future expansion of the system. They were quite, the community was quite upset, and certainly the canal promoters thought that they had been had. MacDonald had promised them, they had lobbied to get Conservatives elected to promote the canal, and what did they do? The government turned around and hired an engineer who would sabotage the project. Well, they had their friends in the Department of Public Works, because another engineer who had done some earlier work contradicted. Now, this is very unusual in government. Certainly today it's unusual. Back then things were a bit freer, I suspect. He wrote a report which he published and said no, that the cost, if they rejigged how they did it, the waterway could be completed for $2 million. Well, you've got one engineer who says 10, another says 2. You've got pressure on the government to continue expanding the system. What are they going to do? What's the absolutely perfect Canadian solution to a really tricky political problem? You appoint a royal commission. And that's exactly what, that's one of the sketches from Rubidge's survey. It shows the waterway from, the proposed waterway from Peterborough up to Lakefield. Interestingly enough, you'll see that the locks are on the east side of the river. So that was Rubidge's scheme, because that's what he was hired to do. It was the cost that he put to doing this work that really caused all the problems. So MacDonald has a problem on his hands. He's got conflicting opinion, he's got all this pressure to keep building. Appoints a Royal Commission in 1888, just after the election when all the Tories had been elected along the waterway. Not everyone was happy. They thought they were being put off again, but the Royal Commission was going to get expert opinion from harbor commissions and from steamboat and shipping operators and do a proper study of this canal scheme. What a great ploy. It may not be a surprise that it took actually 4 years for the commission. One of the commissioners developed illnesses and had to go overseas, and somebody left and they had to bring it on. So 4 years of dragging this canal story out. It really is a tale of how governments can promise and delay and promise and delay. MacDonald was very shrewd in making sure the Conservatives got elected on the promise of building the waterway when they delivered, when it comes right down to it, very little. The 3 locks that we saw in the early 1880s, and the promise of survey work. So the government appointed a Royal Commission, and they finally delivered the report in 1891. I should mention, the reason I have this up, one of the real key players, in fact, after Moss and Boyd left, the chair of the Trent Valley Canal Association, that lobby group, was one Roland Strickland. So Strickland played a key role in promoting the canal. Part of it, I suspect, was because he was situated here in Lakefield, knew the benefits that the navigation system, the waterway system had, and anything that would promote development of the waterway and improve opportunities for business, Strickland was in favor of. So the government appointed the Royal Commission in 1888. They delivered their report in 1891. Curiously enough, just before MacDonald called the election in 1891. Some might call it a deathbed conversion because, in fact, it ended up being. MacDonald was very sick in 1891. Although he campaigned, it was to be his last campaign. And of course, everyone knew that this commission was delivering the report to the Prime Minister. What was it going to say? Well, just before he issued the writ for the 1891 election, MacDonald proudly declared that the Royal Commission recommended that, yes, indeed, the canal should be expanded and that he would continue as the resources of the country would permit. So everyone was hailing this as a major breakthrough, that indeed the government's committed itself to expanding the system. So through the 91 election, all the local candidates, one of the key issues was, how do we get on with this business of building yet more locks to expand the system? In 1891, MacDonald's re-elected. The Conservatives come back in power. MacDonald dies, I think a year later. The subsequent prime ministers, Thompson dies. Conservative Party's in a mess. The government's in a mess. There was a revolt among some of the cabinet ministers. They resigned. Mackenzie Bowell as prime minister. The period 91 to 1896 was very unsettled. Not much happened with canal expansion. Once again, the residents on the waterway, we've been had the Prime Minister promised canal, and people like Strickland and others are saying, you've got to deliver on the promise that you made in 1891 that we took to the electorate, that you promised would. Well, sure enough, in 1895, the government elections coming up, they announced that in fact there will be additional canal construction between Peterborough and Lakefield and between Lake Simcoe and Balsam Lake. So There's a commitment in 95, just before the 1896 election. An old pattern. You'd think the voters would kind of catch on that they're being had. But the promise of expanding the system and new lock construction work was just too much to pass by. So the contracts were let in 1895 for building the system between Peterborough and Lakefield, a series of 4 dams and 5 locks, as well as the major impediment between Peterborough and just above Peterborough, and that's the building of the Peterborough hydraulic lift lock, something that R.B. Rogers, the engineer, took a personal interest in. So we've got that section and the section between Balsam Lake and Lake Simcoe that would finally open up from Peterborough and Hastings right through to Lake Simcoe. So all the area through the Kawarthas, which is rapidly expanding by this period, would now be open. Here's the gentleman that was put in charge of that project, Richard Birdsall Rogers. What a great story. I think it's a great story, a great Canadian story. Rogers was a local boy, grew up in Peterborough, formally trained in McGill, and was brought in the early 1880s to supervise some of the work as a junior engineer. And I thought, how do you get a job in the waterway? You know, in the 1880s, it's oftentimes politics had a lot to do with who got jobs. Well, I discovered that apart from being a very competent engineer, Richard Birdsall Rogers' father-in-law was one Henry Calcutt. Now, Calcutt was the prominent brewer and businessman in Peterborough, and as I discovered, he was also the bagman for the Conservative Party in Peterborough. So I'm sure that didn't hurt, but you know, Rogers did have the technical capability. So he's placed in charge of the Simcoe to Balsam Lake project and the Peterborough to Lakefield division. Work gets underway in 1895. There are crews out. They're clearing the ground. They're buying material. Everything's just running along great. It looks like the 1896 election will be yet another win for the Conservatives, except they're missing Johnny MacDonald, Old Tomorrow, man who was identified with the history of the country to that point. Instead, we had just some of the work that was going on between Nassau Mills and out to Lakefield, that stretch of the Otonabee. So famous in our history, accounts by Samuel Strickland about canoeing down at the rapids. And finally, it's going to be tamed with a series of dams and locks to allow improved navigation along the system. So some good pictures there. Some of the other survey work showing Lakefield. And by this point, the lock is on the west side of the river. So you have Rogers in charge of the project in 95. The 1896 election comes along, and shock of all shocks, the Liberals under Wilfrid Laurier win the election. Now, back up a little bit. All through the 70s and 80s and into the early 1890s, the Liberals are in opposition. They're dead set against this canal, this Trent-Severn Canal, the Trent Valley Canal. They figure it's just a political boondoggle. It's a way of hiring Conservatives, rewarding the boys, and using it as an election ploy to get their members to Ottawa. So throughout the debates, when money is being voted on, they're dead set against the canal. Lo and behold, 1896, the Liberals win the election. They didn't win in Peterborough. R.B. Rogers was quite successful in helping to get the Conservative elected in Peterborough West. And he writes in his diary the day after the election, when the Liberals are now in office, and he's in charge of all these projects, vow not to take as active a role in politics anymore. A little bit like saying the horse is out of the barn, it's time to close the gate. Because he was actually supervising getting people to the polls, not by car. They'd haul them up to the poll in wagons, making sure that the identified Conservative voters got to the poll. The more you study history, the more you realize things really don't change. You know, the means might be different. They're running to the polls with cars instead of horses, but the same basic principle. So Rogers is quite rightly concerned, A, for himself, because he's a well-known Conservative in a government that's now Liberal, But he's also concerned because the Liberals identified the canal as one of the projects they were going to cut. They thought it was a waste of money. In the meantime, he has responsibilities to supervise completion of the Peterborough lift lock and the stretch of canal from Peterborough to Lakefield and from Balsam Lake down to Lake Simcoe. So he carries on with the work. Unfortunately, rumors were circulating that Rogers wasn't really a competent engineer. There were problems with the supervision, the cost overruns on building the lift lock, a small leak that occurred and allowed a bit of water to, well actually it was hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water that spilled into Ashburnham from a breach on the upper reach of the Peterborough lift lock. Rogers was tired of all the sniping and backbiting that questioned his engineering competence. A royal commission was appointed at Rogers' request, and the findings of the commission were that he was incompetent, had overspent his budget, was a poor manager, and should resign. And in fact, that's what the government asked him to do, the Liberal government of Sir Wilfrid Laurier. He was asked to submit his resignation, which he did in 1906, after building this magnificent piece of world-class engineering. It certainly had nothing to do with his engineering competence. It had everything to do with his politics. The Liberals didn't want a conservative in charge of the waterway because how do you, it's not politics, it's a political principle, it's who's on the ins and who's on the outs, because surprisingly, once the Liberals took office and they got deluged with petitions and lobbying by the Trent Valley Canal Association, who didn't care whether it was conservatives or liberals, and they wanted the waterway built. So they would go down with a big delegation from the area, would go to Ottawa. They met with the Prime Minister, and they convinced the Prime Minister that yes, indeed, this waterway was a good idea. Laurier was a pretty shrewd politician. In opposition, you're against it. When you're in the government, suddenly things look a little different. Here's a chance to reward some of the Liberal Party workers, to reward some of the Liberal businesses that supported his campaign. It was a case when the lobbyists from the Canal Association met with the Prime Minister and convinced them that indeed this waterway was a good thing. It was a case of the congregation converting the minister. So Laurier says, yes, we're going to go ahead. Not with Rogers. Rogers is gone, resigned in 1904. New engineer comes in and is responsible for completing the system between Peterborough and Lakefield and between Balsam Lake and Lake Simcoe. But that's not the whole system. I mean, there's no entrance from Lake Ontario, and there's certainly no exit out to Georgian Bay. So what happens? Well, I mentioned that Wilfrid Laurier defeated the Conservatives. Lots of concern what the future of the canal is, but the effective work of the Trent Valley Canal Association, all the business people, the mayors, the reeves, lobbied the government, and the Laurier Liberals agreed to continue expanding the system. This gentleman, A.J. Grant, was brought in from work on the Welland Canal to take charge of the Trent-Severn waterway from 1906 right through until 1918. And he was, as I said, the government agreed that they were going to continue with a slow expansion of the system and committed to build locks between Peterborough and Rice Lake. Now that's not because Laurier was convinced, I'm sure, that canals were a good idea by the 1880s and 1890s. But whenever you had a canal, the system was, wherever there was rapids, you build the dam to flood the rapids out to make navigation easier, and you build the lock to bypass the dam. It was called the slack water system. Well, by the 1890s, early 1900s, you have the development of hydroelectricity. And what you need to run hydro is a head of water. So suddenly the potential of building locks along the Trent River from Rice Lake down to Lake Ontario, you create all these dams, you create a head of water, and that property and that hydro can be leased out to various private companies. Now in Ontario, the provincial government under Whitney was a very strong public hydro proponent. And there was a real debate as to who really controlled this section of the province, the waterway. Was it a provincial or was it a federal? The federal government always said, we're not building a canal system, we're building a few locks to improve navigation. The province said, fine, if it's not a navigation system, we have jurisdictional control. We want to make sure that any hydro development between Trenton and Rice Lake is publicly owned, not privately owned. So I suspect Laurier's commitment to expanding the system was as much to ensure that the federal government maintained control over those high releases, which went to the private sector, rather than giving it to the province to build publicly owned facilities. Nevertheless, whatever the rationale was, the system was expanded, and so we have locks at places like Campbellford, Trenton, Rainy Falls, the flight locks. Not only canal improvements, but several hydro plants, many of which, if you drive across the 401 at Trent, you go across the bridge. That power plant you see just above the bridge along the 401 is a remnant of Laurier's private hydro policy along the system. And it also has a lock nearby it. So as well as the locks, to operate them you need staff. The staff worked full-time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the early years of the canal. And so we have a series of lockmasters' homes being built along the system as well. Well, that kind of gives us part of the system. You can actually go from Trenton to Rice Lake. We're so close, but by now we're into the Laurier Liberals, the projects through the war years. The system is so close to being completed. It took another government and another prime minister, Sir Robert Borden, to actually see the system through. And ironically, by this period in the late war years, it wasn't defense, and it wasn't lumber, and it certainly wasn't prairie wheat, and it had nothing to do per se with hydro development. The reason why the system was finished, and probably its saving grace even today, was the potential for tourism through, particularly in the Severn River. The minister responsible for railways and canals, name escapes me at the moment, had been out there and realized the scenic beauty of this area. And certainly by the early years of the 20th century, tourism, whether it be steamers going families up to the lodges around the Great Lakes and the Muskokas and out through Sparrow Lake. And so the irony is the system was finally completed in the late war years and finally in 1920 because of the potential for tourism that the waterway offered. It had nothing to do with commercial benefits per se, although you certainly could argue that there was a commerce component to it. But it's gone through various rationales and various stages. It's a great story. And so locks at Swift Rapids, there, Couchiching, and its famous Big Chute, the Marine Railway out of Big Chute. It's an interesting story. As I mentioned, the system was finished during the war years, 1916, 1917. Conscriptions involved. The shortage of manpower and materials made it difficult to build the traditional locks. So as a temporary measure during the war, the government built 2 marine railways to allow boats to pass over the water into Georgian Bay. There was one other temporary measure during the Great War. How many of you remember that? Yes, sir, at the back.
Income tax.
Income tax. Well, guess what? We still have a marine railway at Big Chute, and we sure have income tax. So this temporary measure kind of got the system finished with the idea that sometime down the road they would actually build a regular lock. It was reviewed in as late as the 1960s, and at that point there was concern that the sea lamprey might invade the interior lakes, and so they stayed with the marine railway concept at Big Chute. Swift Rapids did get a standard big lock, but it's ironic that a couple of the war measures are still with us today. So there we have 1920, the system is finished. Finally got the canal finished. I wanted to bring in, there's a Lakefield aspect of the story, because in 1879, so 1834 to 1920, the system is finally built. Like Topsy, grew slowly depending on political pressure, the government's will and resources to expand the system. When Rubridge was hired to do his survey in the 1880s to determine the cost of completing the system, he, to build a stretch between Peterborough and Lakefield, just give me 1 second here. realized that they had to get control of the water. They needed to control navigation, the water levels to ensure sufficient depth for navigation. Well, there was a dam in Lakefield that was owned by the Stricklands. 1879 court case comes down. The Stricklands were found to be liable for flooding property above the dam because of the height of the dam. It damaged private property. So Strickland stuck with a potentially fairly hefty bill. Well, Rubich comes along and is doing the survey work, realizes the government needs to control water levels. So he offers to buy out, pretty well has to buy out the Strickland's control of the dam, and at the same time to assume all liability. As well, Strickland was a pretty good negotiator. He not only managed to transfer the responsibility to the federal government, but he also got a $5,000 cash grant to modify his power canal that was used to develop industry along the east shore of the river at Lakefield. So the wool mill and the grist mills and the planing mills and the blacksmith shop, all those industries that were located in Lakefield in the 1870s and 80s, using water power that was controlled by Strickland, they got support to retool when the canal went through. So we can see why Mr. Roland Strickland was a keen promoter of the waterway. It saved him a huge whack of cash for liabilities and got an improved navigation system and an improved power canal to boot. So we got the system built between 1834 and 1920. The recognition that its probably strongest asset was going to be tourism. You didn't get a lot of commercial traffic by the 20s. Well, how do you go about promoting tourism? And again, this is where our history repeats itself. This gentleman probably never heard of him, William Humphrey Bennett. And yet he is a key player in the story of the Trent-Severn waterway. There's a little bit of his background: born in Barrie, a lawyer, ran as a conservative in '91, lost, ran again, served until 1917, appointed to the Senate, died in 1925. But he was responsible for creating the Trent Development Association. And that was an organization not to lobby governments. That waterway's built. What we have to do now is promote its many advantages for tourism. And so Humphreys, along with, Bennett rather, along with Reeves and Wardens and boards of commerce, business organizations, form an association. The inaugural meeting was in Peterborough in 1920. Every municipality kicked in 5 cents per head, depending on your population. And with that pool of money, they created a brochure, a very attractive brochure. The only copy I found is in the Choate's papers at Trent University. This is a brochure that was produced in the 1920s to promote the waterway. So it's got all kinds of articles, articles inside that talk about the lodges and fishing and swimming and boating and all the things you can do. They created displays that went to the boat shows down in New York. Even over to Europe, there were boat shows in England. Of course, the Peterborough Canoe is famous over in Britain. And so they're going to promote, come to Canada and enjoy the benefits of the Kawarthas. They also created a black and white silent movie of a boat going through Stony Lake and going through the Kawarthas in the early 1920s. And I was surprised and quite pleased to actually find there is a copy of that silent movie produced by this company to promote the waterway. The copy's in the National Archives. I have it, and if I was more computer literate, I probably could run a little clip. I've seen it, and it's wonderful. It shows boats going through through Stony Lake. It shows the regattas in the 1920s. It's a wonderful piece of, and I can't recall if there's material on Lakefield, because it does kind of follow the waterway system. So they did all this promotion, displays and stuffed fish to take down to New York. And the association from 1920 was active right even into the early 1930s. Don't know what happened to it, but here's an organization that was doing what they can with significant resources to promote tourism in the waterway. Well, what are we doing in the year 2005? We've got a great idea. Why don't we get some brochures and videos and literature that will help promote tourism on the waterway? We thought this was a great idea. Well, this group had been way ahead, doing it as early as the 1920s. Of course, tourism was important to Lakefield. Lakefield was a booming manufacturing center, as we know, but it was also a major jumping off point for the Kawartha Lakes, and particularly Stony River. And so the waterway was a real benefit, and certainly promoting tourism was a benefit to the businesses in Lakefield. So many of you will be familiar with the stories of the steamers taking off from Lakefield to draw people off through the resorts and cottages along Lake Simcoe, or along the Kawarthas. Just a nice shot of the hydro, because hydro was important to Lakefield as well. The hydro plant that was the Strickland initiative in the late early 1890s, and finally bought out by Ontario Hydro in the 1930s. Still produces power. I don't know what the arrangement is between the plant and the waterway. I think they're looking for more revenue from the hydro. Although the canal was completed in the 1920s, there's still a lot of work to do. There's maintenance and upkeep. There's repairs that go on. One of the really big challenges was managing all of the reservoir lakes in the Halliburtons. That was originally controlled by the province. The province turned over Youngs Point, Rosedale, and Lindsay to the federal government to complete the system, as well as responsibility for all the reservoir lakes up in the Halliburtons. So major commitment by the government to keep the dams up, to look after the water levels up in that area. Well, 1930s, not a lot of tourism, despite the promotion work. The war in the 1940s, but the 1950s and early 1960s, recreational boating just booms. We've got the power boats that are zooming up and down the waterway. There is a real need to deal with the heavy boat traffic. How to deal with that, what changes to make, what's appropriate for an historic canal. Some of the work started on the Rideau. It got a lot of criticism. How did the government deal with the criticism for changes it was making in the historic laws? Appointed a commission to look at the whole issue. The Rideau, Trent, Severn study group, courts, came out with a wonderful report that recommended recommended that the Rideau be designated as a historic canal and be preserved, and that the Trent Severn be recognized as a recreational waterway and be modernized. And so changes occurred in the Peterborough lift lock. Some of the equipment was modernized. The flight locks at Burley Falls were changed to a single lock. Kirkfield was modernized. So a lot of the historic components of the Trent system were lost during the early 1960s when modernization was underway. Well, this was a great initiative, the province and the federal government working together to create a comprehensive vision for the waterway. Where did it go? There's a copy of it sitting on the shelf. All those good reports and recommendations, nothing came of it. However, not to worry, because just recently the government had another good idea when some issues came up on how do we manage this Trent-Severn waterway. We'll appoint a commission to canvass opinion, to get at good ideas. We'll produce it as a report to create a vision for how we can manage and promote the waterway in the future. And they produced, after over a year of consultation with communities and special interest groups, produced this wonderful document, many of whom I'm sure you've seen it and probably contributed to some of the public meetings and discussions. And it's all about the water. And it says we've got to do a better job promoting tourism. We've got to protect our heritage assets. We've got to do a better job telling the story of the history of the waterway, its engineering, its economic benefits. All of these great recommendations are in the report. Well, I think you know where this story's going. Because this past year, the government has announced severe cuts to the waterway. The manager for visitor services, gone. Manager for the historic assets, my position, when I retired, positions eliminated. The manager for natural resource conservation and all good environmental practices, gone. The visitor center at the lift lock, hours reduced, 2 days a week it's going to be closed. Tuesdays and Wednesdays. This is in complete contradiction to what was committed by the government in the Trent Severn waterway report. It's all about the water. It's discouraging in some respects because we had such high hopes and the government created all these expectations. But if you look back in the history, we've had commissions and we've had high points and low points, promises that were never fulfilled. I try and take the long view. This too shall pass. The waterway, despite what the government may feel, can never be totally reduced in terms of operation because of the key issue of managing water. Water is absolutely essential from Georgian Bay right through. The dams and the locks all regulate the flow of water from Balsam Lake to Georgian Bay and from Balsam Lake down to Lake Ontario. So even if they want to walk away, they never can do that. And if they're committed to do it, why not do it well and promote the assets that the waterway has? Well, that's my take on it. And as I said, I'm a retired public servant, so I don't have to get permission from anyone to tell them like I see it. The other concern I have, this is a real, I think, a concern for all the heritage communities, is what do we do with all those wonderful assets? Not only on the waterway, but as you see here, all the letters and journals and diaries and photographs and records that relate to the building and maintenance of the waterway, dating right back to the survey that Baird did in the 1830s. There is a tremendous resource at the Waterway Archives that documents the story of building and operating the system. And with no one specifically in charge, I feel it's in jeopardy. So that's why I continue to volunteer, as you heard, as a historian for the waterway, to kind of keep an eye on these tremendous assets, make sure they don't go astray, and that they're used to tell the story of the waterway. So, the future of the TSW, well, as you can tell, we've had tough times before. This one is very severe because of the loss of expertise there. But I remain perpetually hopeful because the story of the waterway has been up and down, and promises made and not kept. But eventually the system was built and operated, and although we're in a dark period now, the pendulum will swing. So with that, I'll draw to a close. It's a little longer than the 40 minutes I promised you, but it's a great story. It's a long story. I think it's one that really deserves to be told. So thank you for your patience.
That was a fantastic presentation as far as I'm concerned. I was very, very interested myself for 2 or 3 different reasons. One was that my grandfather built the dam that exists here in Lakefield, and he also built the dam that exists today in Mounts Point. So he was an engineer, and he lived in Lindsay at the time, and I guess he must have voted the right way, according to what because he got these contracts, and he did a great job on them. And he spent a lot of time in Lakefield. And my father, in his early days when he was a student at University of Toronto, he worked for his father as a diver here in Lakefield when they were building the canal and so on and so forth. And he said he used to spend more time underwater than he did above. But so I have a definite historical connection with Lakefield in that regard, and I really enjoyed the presentation tonight. There were a couple of things. He said that Peterborough was famous in England because of its canoes. Well, he should remember that the canoes were built in Lakefield before they were built in Peterborough.
Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. A Strickland initiative too, I should add.
But I'm sure that Dennis would be happy to answer any questions if you would like to ask. Am I presuming this?
Absolutely, Ed. If you want to do it now or over coffee after, because I know the hour is getting on.
Right now, if anybody has a question, I'm sure he'd be interested in answering. Go ahead.
Dennis, you mentioned that the Rideau was designated as a historical canal, and the Trent Severn was a recreational one. But now with the latest cutbacks, they've all been chunked together under one administration. How is that going to work?
Good point, Don. As you may have read in the paper, the superintendent for the Trent Canal was I won't say fired, was Her job was eliminated, and the canal management will now be centered in Smith Falls. So the manager of the Rideau Canal will also have responsibility for the Trent-Severn waterway. If you can imagine a more heavy responsibility, two totally different systems, different clientele, different issues. The Rideau is all stone. Peterborough, the Trent-Severn is concrete, steel, not wood. Watershed for the Trent system, I forget how many thousands and thousands of acres. That affects flooding, water control, business, hydro development, recreational boating, need I go on? Those issues, I feel, demand and require a single boss, not somebody who does it as a sideline. But that's the government's approach towards managing the deficit. I'm surprised you didn't mention about the inquiry with Mr. Holgate and Mr. Rogers. That may come up later. I mentioned the Royal Commission. Don and I did a reenactment for an Historical Society event in which Don played the well-known Mr. Holgate, who was in charge of the commission and found Rogers incompetent as an engineer. And I took on the role of R.B. Rogers, who defended himself very eloquently, I was told. But nevertheless, I did have to resign my position in 1906. So it was a historical reenactment. It was lots of fun, good history, and I think it brought some issues around the story of the lift lock to the public.
If Plainfield Historical Society wanted this, I'm sure we could resurrect it.
I think we'd be happy to do that. I'd like to know more about Strickland. He played a very important role in the Trent Valley Canal Association as president. He wrote to the Prime Minister. He kept lobbying to get the canal expanded. We all associate the Stricklands a bit with the lumber industry, and it was very significant here. They were churning out 60,000 board feet over a season. A lot of lumber came out of this area. But Strickland was also a very effective lobbyist to get the waterway built. I thought pretty shrewd too. We got the government to take over his dam and give him cash for